we have, are we rolling? Can I get a cue?
We are recording. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. The January 12th, 2021 meeting of the Public Safety and Human Services Committee will come to order. It is 9:31 a.m. I'm Lisa Herbal, chair of the committee. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Council Member Lewis.
Present.
Councilmember Morales.
Here.
Councilmember Sawant.
Here.
Councilmember Herbold.
Here.
And Councilmember Gonzalez will be joining us shortly.
Thank you, Alex. So on today's agenda, we will be hearing 6 appointments to the Community Police Commission, the appointment of Curry Mayor to the Office for Emergency Management, and finally, we'll have another discussion concerning options to amend the council's crowd control weapons ordinance developed with options developed and proposed by our police accountability partners. With that, we'll now approve our agenda for our committee meeting. If there's no objection, today's agenda will be adopted. Hearing no objection, today's agenda is adopted. At this time, we will transition into public comment. I will moderate the public comment period in the following manner. Each speaker will be given 2 minutes to speak. I will call on each speaker by name and in the order in which they've registered on the council's website. If you've not yet registered to speak but would like to do so, you can sign up before the end of the public hearing by going to the council's website. The link is also listed on today's agenda. Once I call a speaker's name, you will hear a prompt. And once you've heard that prompt, you will need to press *6 to unmute yourself. Please begin by stating your name and the item which you are addressing, the item on the agenda which you are addressing. Speakers will hear a chime when 10 seconds are left of the allotted time. Once the speaker hears the chime, we ask that you begin to wrap up your public comments. If speakers do not end their comments at the end of the allotted time provided, the speaker's mic will be muted after 10 seconds in order to allow us to hear from the next speaker. Once you've completed your public comment, please disconnect from the line. And if you plan to continue following the meeting, please do so via the Seattle channel or the listening options that are listed on the agenda. Public comment is for about 20 minutes, although we are always open to including more time, assuming our agenda allows it. Just want to note to our clerks, I have not received a public comment sign-up sheet, which I need. Alex?
Councilmember, I just sent the list over to you via email, both to you.
All right, there it is. Thank you very much. All right, so we have 20 people signed up for public comment here, but not all of them are present. So what I would like council indulgence to do is we'll consider whether or not we need to add more time dependent to the agenda, dependent on how we get through this current list. But I'm going to start by calling the first 2 names on the list, and that would be Howard Gale, followed by Polly G. Howard?
Good morning. Howard Gale, District 7, commenting on police abuse and accountability. Seattle officer Mike Solon, the head of the Seattle Police Union, is currently under fire for retweeting tweets blaming Black Lives Matter for last week's insurrection in the D.C. Solon ran a campaign for union president last year where he promised to get, quote, serious, unquote, with protesters. Last year has seen overwhelming evidence of the failure of police reform, entering its 9th year now, and what it looks like when police follow Mike Solon's call to get serious. The egregious and hateful abuse of protesters, including intentionally hurting people with glass balls and punches, kneeling on people's necks, having over a dozen Seattle officers stand unresponsive and unmoved to the pain of an illegally arrested woman while she lies helpless on the pavement, having repeated seizures and hundreds of other cases of abuse. With all this evidence of the near decade-long failure of police training, policy, and accountability, the council now debates what weapons out-of-control officers should assault us with. Of course, you need to take away all the less lethal tools that they have used to assault those they are sworn to protect and serve, but instead have punished and shattered. You need to uphold the ban that you voted for a few months ago. But they still have their cars and their fists and their knees and their clubs and their bikes to assault us with, which they have done. So we need to also debate how to hold police to account, regardless of whether they abuse us with a blast ball or a bike or a billy club. We need fully civilianized police oversight and accountability. For myself, I have been assaulted with blast balls and I've been assaulted with clubs. And for someone who suffers a neurological brain injury, it really doesn't matter whether it was a blast ball or a club. Thank you.
Councilmember, you're muted.
Thank you, Alex. Our next speaker is Polly G, followed by Kate Rubin. Polly?
Hi, can you hear me?
Kate, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Paulie Giulianati. I am a police accountability activist and resident of Seattle. I gathered signatures for Initiative 940, campaigned for its eventual passage, and forwarded community interest during rulemaking implementation of the law in 2019. I still work every day with the families of the victims of police violence, who are my friends and colleagues, and as we speak are forwarding their agenda for racial justice at the state legislature in Olympia. And I'm a part of a great team that has drafted proposed legislation to radically change the legal landscape of police accountability in the state. And I sincerely thank and admire all the members of the movement in Seattle fighting for true police accountability. I vehemently oppose the city council watering down or repealing the ban on tear gas, blast balls, chemical weapons, and all the weapons of war that they unleashed on Seattle's public this past summer. The intention of Councilmember Herbold and other police apologists is to create a Swiss cheese law where the exceptions to the law swallow the ban, effectively reinstating the ability of law enforcement to terrorize our communities with weapons of war. I welcome the votes of Councilmember Herbold, Mosqueda, and Gonzalez, all of whom voted to approve the unaccountable police union contract in 2018, further demonstrating their support to allow law enforcement to act with impunity and their voting opposition to Black lives. Mark my words, if they vote to repeal these bans, pictures of all those injured by these weapons will be distributed at their campaign events. They will have to answer why they believe Seattle police is trustworthy enough to possess and use these weapons after their abhorrent behavior this past summer. The small child who was maced, the tear gas, which was so abused that it caused babies to foam from their mouths in their cribs. Council members will have to answer the votes, and I welcome the clarity that they will provide. Good day.
Thank you. Next speaker is Kate Rubin, followed by Castile Hightower. Kate? Do we have Kate Rubin with us?
Good morning. Yes, this is Kate Rubin. I am a resident of District 2, and I'm the Executive Director of Be Seattle. I'm calling today in support of the poverty defense bill introduced by Councilmember Herbold. Criminalizing poverty isn't helping anyone. It just upholds a racist and broken criminal justice system. It is well documented that Black and brown people of color statistically receive harsher sentences for committing the same crimes as their white counterparts. They're also more likely to live below the poverty line. Poverty defense is an essential portion of criminal justice reform. I've heard a lot of framing around this, like there will suddenly be a surge in theft and property crime, but the idea that the only thing preventing these things from happening is fear of prosecution is ludicrous. Desperate people are already doing desperate things in order to get their basic needs met, and by lumping willful and malicious criminals with people who are just trying to survive. We make it more difficult for people to break out of the poverty cycle. We've been filling our jails with people who couldn't afford to support their families, taking them away from any opportunities to earn money, giving them criminal background, which makes it harder to get a job. It's not helping anyone. It's not helping the businesses. This is a good choice, and I think it's important that we move forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And just for the public, because I imagine there may be many people who are scouring the council's introduction and referral calendar after Kate's testimony, but there has not been legislation introduced yet at this time. Next speaker is Castile Hightower, followed by Karen Taylor. Castile.
My name is Castile Hightower. My brother was killed by Seattle police in 2004 when he was experiencing a mental health crisis, and my family has still not gotten justice. Seattle's Black Lives Matter movement won the first in the nation ban on the police use of the so-called crowd control weapons last summer during the height of the street protests. Councilmember Sawant brought this forward in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter street protests, and we won a unanimous vote because our movement fought for it. Many activists will remember how over 200 people called in to fight to win that strong ban. Day after day, Black Lives Matter peaceful protesters were attacked by Seattle police, showered with tear gas, pepper spray, blast balls, and other military-grade weapons, some weapons deemed unfit even for war. In contrast, less than a week ago, we saw police in Washington, D.C. coddling a violent far-right mob as they took over the Capitol building in a blatant attempt to overturn a Democratic election result. We have seen over and over and over that these weapons, this police violence, is reserved for left-wing protests, for Black Lives Matter, not for the far-right mobs. I urge the Democratic Party council members to do the right thing, to uphold your own vote from last June, stand with our movement, stand with Shama Sawant, and reject any watering down of this ban. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Karen Taylor, followed by Aurora Hall Mullins. Karen?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My name is Karen Taylor, and I'm calling in about the chemical weapons ban. I want to call in just to let you know that it's not just people who've been very personally affected or who are just sort of extreme socialists or something want this bill upheld. I'm an ordinary citizen. I'm on disability, so I have time to come testify. I'm not representing any particular group. I do have a small group of friends and acquaintances that I know I'm representing right now. We haven't forgotten that violence. We have to have people medicing all these marches all the time because we know what violence can happen, and no one's assured that it won't happen. People I love are spending their time out in the cold, marching, medicing, and we need you to do your part in your warm homes to keep chemical weapons out of the hands of police. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Our next speaker, Aurora Hall Mullins, is noted as not present. We'll come back if she returns. Next on the list is Kurt Sorensen. Kurt? Are you with us, Kurt?
My name is Kurt Sorensen. I have an advanced degree in rehabilitation and a decade of experience in getting marginalized people back to work. Please reject council any proposal by Gonzalez or Sawant. Their stated goals is to destroy capitalism, to dissolve the banking system and the private businesses and remove private ownership of housing. Any revolutionist knows to attain power and control over the masses, you must first induce chaos by removing law and order and impeding the flow of income to individuals. Many of you on the council have denounced the faith of your parents and live without a spiritual barometer. Please note that all ancient scriptures, the Quran, the Bible, the Torah, even the writings of Hindi Astia, denounce stealing and the destruction of others' property in order to keep an orderly society. Allowing crime is encouraging crime. Your approval in this decriminalizing effort completely ignores the cry of every small business in Seattle. Please don't betray them. Surround has no intent to elevate anyone out of poverty, only to use immigrants and minorities as pawns in her political movement. She grew up with servants. She knows how it works. She's from an elitist family. Decriminalizing theft and burglary, assault, drug dealing is not a course to help anyone. Dismissing the interests and concerns of our small businesses and not addressing tested programs and is not fulfilling your obligations. We have the money in this city. Martin Luther King asked us to focus on the character of people, not the race or their color.
The next speaker, Madison Fitzpatrick, is not listed as being present, so we'll move on to Valerie Schulrich. Valerie?
Hi, I'm Valerie Schulrich. I live in Beacon Hill. I hope you all followed citizen journalists last summer and didn't just rely on corporate news media. If so, you'll have seen that SPD approached the Black Lives Matter free speech protests with belligerence, escalation, and military weapons and beyond military-grade weapons like tear gas. Although bad policing was repeatedly reported and many incidents that seriously harmed nonviolent protesters, there has been no real accountability to date. Given our current system, there won't be. Consider blast balls. They seriously wound people from permanent limb damage to blindness. Anyone who thinks police should use these weapons on the Seattle populace in any situation has a twisted view of how human nature and behavior work. It is the job of elected representatives in a democracy to enable a safe society through social justice and mutual cooperation, not through control, oppression, and police violence. The legislation banning crowd control weapons like blast balls and tear gas should be defended and written without loopholes. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peter Shalito. Peter?
Good morning. Hello, my name is Peter Shalito. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a scientist and I'm a resident of District 4. I'd like to speak against watering down or repealing the ban on police use of tear gas, chemical weapons, flashbangs, and other so-called crowd control weapons. I encourage you to fight to lift the legal restrictions on implementing this ban without watering it down or introducing loopholes. The rights of individuals to exercise their First Amendment rights was grossly violated this summer with the repeated unwarranted use of weapons intentionally assaulting and injuring residents. A nurse got pepper sprayed while trying to help someone, a small girl got mace in the face, and TK got tackled in a skull fracture while she was being arrested for a misdemeanor. This affects individuals as well as the entire Capitol Hill neighborhood as gas wafted up into apartments requiring people to evacuate the safety of their homes in the middle of the night. I urge you to fight for the strongest possible ban on police weapons. If officers are too afraid to work with these reasonable restrictions, they can always quit. I have full faith in my community to provide for public safety nonviolently through well-funded education, after-school programs, food and housing programs, pedestrian-only zones, and other initiatives. Thank you for listening. Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. Our next speaker, who is listed that is present, is Michael Malini. Michael, can you join us, please? Michael, I think you're still on mute. You want to hit *6? There you go.
Hi, my name's Michael Malini. I'm a renter in District 3, and I had tear gas enter my apartment through open windows this summer after being deployed by SPD during a peaceful demonstration. I'm calling for the City Council to uphold the ban on these crowd control weapons and not water them down or repeal the ban, and fight the restrictions placed by the Justice Department rather than uplifting altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker who is listed as present is Eric Salinger, followed by Aisling Cooney. Eric?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. Hi, so my name is Eric Salinger from District 7. I'm calling basically to support the crowd control weapons ban. My understanding is that blanket banning of crowd control weapons may not be sustainable, and I'd like to encourage you to do as much as you can to keep those bans in place. But I think there's a couple of other areas that we need to focus on. Number one, there's a reasonableness standard for using crowd control weapons. That standard needs to not be a reasonable police officer, because reasonable police officers in this city have gone to Washington, D.C. to participate in an insurrection against the federal government. It needs to be an average citizen of Seattle. This is a problem with a lot of laws around police in general, is that they use this reasonable officer standard, and police are not reasonable. The second issue that we need to address is the police department's use of bikes. There are a number of cases. 2019-0880 from the OPA is one of them, where a police officer rides his bike into somebody, which would be an assault if I did it, then uses that contact and that person's lack of immediate deference and submission to justify arresting and deploying additional force against that individual. The police have done this to protesters. The police have done this in that OPA case to somebody who wasn't even involved in the demonstration. And they also slammed another woman up against a building in the process of doing that. They didn't arrest her because she said, "I'm sorry," to the officer who hit her with a bike. We saw a police officer, who still hasn't been fired, by the way, ride his bike over a protester's head. So I think that we do have, and I know that there have been some recommendations around those kinds of uses of force, but they need to be sort of more heavily codified. Lastly, well, I think I'm out of time, so I may just email you the last part, but I just think we really need to keep these bans up and keep pushing on the police. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Our next speaker is Aisling Cooney.
Hi, my name is Ashleen Cooney. I am a local Seattle activist. I have been involved in the protests. I've seen a lot of the violence. I also myself am out from my assault on July 25th, and I'm still in physical therapy. I'm still in regular therapy. I still have nightmares. I still have a ban on tear gas. We need a ban on crowd control weapons, military weapons. The people calling in against it and berating Kashama, those are the same people who probably would storm the Capitol. And I just need council to start taking this seriously. Our trauma is real, and we are still suffering. We need that full ban on crowd control weapons. Police should not be throwing flashbangs at our heads. They should not be gassing us. They should not be pepper spraying people like me until they go to the hospital. None of this should be happening. And I also have a strong critique of why council is acting surprised, and like Mike Solin's behavior now is inadmissible when he's been acting like this the whole time. I mean, Mike Solon and Carmen Best have been lying about BLM activists since May, putting us in direct danger of white supremacists, including car attacks and Trump's threat of DHS, which escalated the protests that day too. Remember when they called an unlit candle from a memorial an IED, and that was blasted all over, that we were having explosives? It was a memorial candle. Do you remember when Mike Solon blasted "Save a Horse, Ride a Cowboy" from SPOG headquarters as officers rode out and brutalized us with joy? Do you remember when they said we extorted businesses at gunpoint, which was also proven false? These lies are not new. This behavior is not new. Mike Solon has been trying to do this all along, telling all these lies, and we've been attacked all along. And it seems like council only cares now that white supremacists are attacking politicians. Thank you.
Thank you. We are at the 20-minute mark, and I see a few people who were marked as not present have returned to the public comment lobby. So if there are no objections, I would like to expand our agenda to allow for another 10 minutes of public comment. Hearing no objections, the agenda is amended, and we will move on to hear from Jeffrey Fernandez, followed by Aurora Hall Mullins. Jeffrey.
Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning, Jeff Fernandez here, father of 2 young children, District 5, shame on Juarez. I'd like to speak to SPD attacking civilians. Dear council members, please remember we hold you accountable for the violence SPD inflicts on our communities. You can make the police friends instead of the racist and violent enemies they have become and you have enabled. Enemies are people who ride bikes over our skulls, beat us while we are handcuffed and defenseless, dress and act like a foreign military, and attack us with crowd control weapons. Only you can stop this. It would be criminally negligent of you to weaken the chemical weapons ban. Fascist-leaning right-wing SPD has shown they only terrorize the public when using these weapons against protesters. You must make the SPD accountable to civilian rule. No more independence, no more above-the-law nonsense, no more license to harm and kill citizens, no more corrupt OPA investigation. You must create a citizen-led OPA without any police collaborators corrupting the process of justice. OPA is loaded with stonewalling cop advocates who prevent justice at every opportunity. OPA is a farce as it currently exists. Get rid of Mike Solon. It's long overdue for that. He is a toxic fascist. And please uphold the ban, expand it, do not weaken it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Aurora Hall Mullins, followed by Hannah Lindell Smith. Aurora?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Good morning, council members. My name is Aurora Hall Mullins. I am a member of District 7. I am calling because I'm very concerned about us repealing a ban on weapons of warfare. These agents not only affect the peaceful protesters that are exercising their constitutional rights, it also affects the neighborhood in which these weapons are deployed. There are children living here. There are pets living in these apartments that are affected by these tear gas, by these blast bombs. It is traumatizing to these people in these neighborhoods. It is also strange to me that in order to get a federal consent decree lifted, which addresses SPD's use of excessive force, we are trying to repeal a ban which allows the use of excessive force. Sorry, it is very frustrating to have to explain all this because these are lethal weapons and less than lethal weapons, so I'm very frustrated. I feel that we need to reimagine how we handle concerns that the community is trying to give their elected officials. Protests are concerns that the working class people, everyday people are trying to explain to you this is how we feel about things. We need you to be listening to this, and we need to be handling things in a more humane manner. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Hannah Lindell Smith. Hannah?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. So my name is Hannah Lindell Smith, and I am a member of District 1, commenting on upholding the ban on chemical and less lethal weapons. This past summer, with all of the BLM protests over police injustice and systemic racism, I was at home watching news of kids well younger than me being maced in the eye, protesters blinded with rubber bullets, and others. So the news looked like Hunger Games, honestly. It was crazy. It was really scary. I was scared to go to protests because a lot of them were peaceful, and still the chemical weapons would get broken out. I do not think this is okay. A lot of these weapons that are used definitely do seem to be reserved for left-wing Black Lives Matter protests, as was seen last week when white nationalists staged an attempted coup on the halls of Congress and were, for the most part, escorted out peacefully, while tear gas, which is a substance actually banned by the Geneva Council, it's banned from warfare. It should not be being used on peaceful protests. Please uphold this ban. Thank you.
Thank you. That, I believe, concludes public comment. Appreciate everybody being with us today. And with that, we'll move into the business items on our agenda. Before we do that, I just want to give a quick chair's report on a piece of legislation that we expected to begin discussion of today in today's meeting, and that is the carryover budget legislation related to additional cuts to the Seattle Police Department in order to address the additional 2020 overtime expenditure. We're not hearing that bill in this meeting as originally planned. We are waiting for additional data regarding separations from the police department, separations of officers who have left the police department, because that impacts both the remaining 2020 budget, as well as it impacts the number of dollars that can be spent in 2021 by the Seattle Police Department, and ultimately would impact our deliberations around this bill. So each central staff, the city budget office, and the mayor's office have requested additional time to get that data, that important financial information that we need to continue deliberations. I agreed because I too want to have be operating and making budget decisions based on real information about the financial situation of the department. So hopefully we will be bringing that bill forward in our next meeting on the 26th. So the first items on the agenda are items 1 through 6, and that is the Community Police Commission reappointments. These are all reappointments. There are 6 of them. 2 each are from the 3 appointing bodies, meaning the 3 appointing bodies, the council, mayor, and the Community Police Commission, are the authority for nominating individuals to serve on the commission. So typically our convention is we ask that the representative from the body with the authority to nominate present the appointments. So what that means is I would like each Reverend Waldron to represent the Community Police Commission. She's here with us today. Thank you. And she will speak both to the work of the CPC, the Community Police Commission, and then we will hear from her about the CPC recommended appointments. Then we'll hear from Deputy Mayor Washington about the recommended appointments coming from the mayor's office to the CPC. And then we'll hear from the council representative, my aide, Newell Aldrich, to hear about the 2 reappointments that are being put forward by the Seattle City Council. The CPC reappointments may be at the meeting, and if so, they can briefly speak to their interest in continuing to serve, but by the council's standards and policies, we do not require reappointments to be present, though we do expect that new appointments be present at their council confirmation hearing. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Reverend Walden to first speak about the work of the CPC, and then let us know about the 2 representatives that the CPC is recommending that the council reappoint. Thank you.
Councilmember, can I read them into the record first real quick?
Oh, my apologies. Yes,
Sorry.
Alex, please do read items 1 through 6 into the record.
Thank you. Item number 1, appointment 01753, reappointment of Alana Santalan as member of Community Police Commission for a term to December 31, 2022. Item number 2, appointment 017554, reappointment of Suzette Dickerson as member of Community Police Commission for a term to December 31, 2023. Item number 3, appointment 01755, reappointment of Aaron B. Goodman as member of Community Police Commission for a term to December 31, 2023. Item number 4, appointment 01756, reappointment of Douglas E. Wagoner as member of Community Police Commission for a term to December 31, 2023. Item number 5, appointment 01758, reappointment of Prachi Vipanchani Dave as member of Community Police Commission for a term to December 31, 2023. And item number 6, appointment 01759, reappointment of Laurent Baker as member of Community Police Commission for a term to December 31, 2023.
Thank you, Alex. And again, my apologies, Reverend Walden. I now hand it over to you.
Oh, good morning. Thank you so much, Councilmember Herbert. The Seattle Community Police Commission was created by the consent decree and was made permanent by the landmark legislation accountability ordinance in 2017 to be a voice of the community in the police accountability process. As you already stated, the commission is composed of 21 commissioners, selected 7 selected by the council, by the mayor, and 7 by the 7 by each appointing authority, the council, the mayor's office, and the CPC. And our work is to continue to try to achieve police accountability in Seattle. It's important now more than ever. I'm here to present for reappointment 2 outstanding commissioners who has been serving here on the commission. First, I want to present Pachi Daivai. Pachi has been she's been with us as a commissioner for a little over a year, and I mean, she's had a huge impact. She's served as a co-chair of the, along with myself, actually, and has done a fantastic job in that. In this critical time, she's helped lead the effort. Not only being a co-chair, but also the ban on the crowd weapons, use of the weapons against the citizens. She has helped. Also, she was really instrumental in helping us in the court system when we were filing. Actually, we did file for the against the city when the city wanted to remove the come from under the consent decree. We did file that, and we did not withdraw our filing. It is still in the court. She was absolutely a part of that. So at this moment, I think that she's here. She's done just a fantastic job as a co-chair. I mean, she stepped up, but she's been on the commission a little over a year. And she stepped up in a great way to be able to be one of the co-chairs and to give absolutely great leadership. I mean, and I'm so happy to say that Pachi has been such a great co-chair with me, and this is our last probably public appearance as co-chairs, because next week would be an election for a new co-chair. So I think Pachi is here. So Pachi, would you like to say a few words?
No, thank you very much, Reverend Walden, for those very kind words. I believe that you have covered everything, and thank you for the including me in the reappointment process. Thank
you. All right, I think that Ms. Laurent Baker had to leave. She's preparing for I have a case in front of the Supreme Court, so she's not on right now. But Laurent is our newest commissioner, but has had such a massive impact. She's taken leadership in the statewide advocacy for the CPC. She's led the CPC in creating our first real state legislative agenda, and has positioned us well to advocate for a major change in Olympia this year, 2021. Laurent is also in the process of helping build the CPC through Commissioner's Recruiting Committee. Through her work with others on the commission, we hope to have a brand new commissioners for you to appoint here in a few in the coming months. Laurent has only been on the commission for 6 months, but boy, she's been powerful. She's just been working on, she stepped up right away to take leadership, and that's really good for us, for people to step up right away. So so we recommend, the CPC is recommending that LaRon Baker also be reappointed. Thank you. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Reverend Baker. Really appreciate it. I think we'll hand it over next to Deputy Mayor Washington to present the reappointments that the mayor's office is moving forward.
Thank you, Councilmember Herbold, and good morning. It is my pleasure to present the mayor's reappointments to the Community Police Commission. Those reappointments are Aaron Goodman and Suzette Dickerson. I'm not sure if either one are on, but I'm going to walk through these points, and then if they're on the phone, they can definitely unmute to speak. So Aaron Goodman is the executive director of the Soto Business Improvement Area, representing businesses in the heart of Seattle's industrial community since 2014. Her role includes cultivating collaborative relationships between BIA, business and property owners, elected officials, City of Seattle departments, and community organizations. Aaron has also served on the South Precinct Advisory Council, working to build connections between the precinct and the community. I'm very excited that Aaron has agreed to continue to serve on the Community Police Commission. She's done great work over her first term, including her recent undertaking of updating the commission's bylaws. And so that is Aaron Goodman. I do not see Aaron on, so I will move on to Suzette Dickerson. Suzette graciously filled out the remainder of a vacated term last year, and I'm excited that she will continue to serve in her second term. Suzette is the staff representative for the Washington State Council of County and City Employees with a demonstrated history of working in the government relations industry. She's skilled in team building, management, leadership, and labor relations. She has a strong passion for helping others, coupled and is driven by equity and social justice. These two components are a driving force for her work day in and day out. Notably, she is serving as the commission's representative during the collective bargaining process. And so those are the two mayoral reappointments. And I don't see Suzette on the phone either.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Washington. Really appreciate you being with us this morning. This is my first chance to congratulate you in person. So congratulations on serving Mayor Durkin in your new role as Deputy Mayor. And again, thank you for bringing forward these fine candidates for reappointment. Moving on to Noel Aldrich, who will present the reappointments from the council.
Thank you, Council Member. The first of the two council appointments is Alina Santillan. Alina works as the Director of Racial Equity for the Seattle Center cohort, supporting Seattle Center organizations to strengthen their racial equity strategies and practices. He previously worked at KEXP 90.3 in several roles as Community Engagement Manager and is a graduate of the Seattle Community Police Academy, and has volunteered for a number of nonprofit organizations, including Youth Care, the Rainier Valley Corps, and the Black Prisoners Caucus at Clallam Bay. The second council appointment is Douglas Wagoner. Douglas has a broad range of experience in local, state, and federal government, including youth violence prevention, cultural competency, and communications. He served as Director of Communications for the King County Prosecutor's Office, Communications Lead at the Office of Healthy and Safe Communities in the Washington State Department of Health. He chairs the Advocacy Committee on the West Seattle Food Bank Board of Directors and has an additional wide range of experience in government and youth violence prevention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noel. Really appreciate it. And at this point, I'd love to open it up to any council members who might have comments that they would like to offer. And I'm going to be watching for folks either come on camera and come on or come off of mute is my cue. And seeing none, what I will do now is, again, just giving a little pause, making sure I'm not cutting off any discussion from council members. Seeing none, I would like to move items 1 through 6 for a vote. Appointments.
Sorry, Councilmember Herbold.
Oh. Councilmember Swan. Oh.
Sorry, I was a little late.
No problem. Have that.
Thank you, Chair Herbold, and I appreciate your committee bringing these items forward today. And I welcome all the comments by Reverend Walden and other speakers, and just wanted to welcome the new appointees and the sort of the reappointees, and just wanted to make a few general comments. The Community Police Commission, in my view, has been the only one of the what are called the accountability partners for the city establishment that we have seen consistently defend the rights of the many people who've been brutalized by police officers. We heard a lot of public comment about it as well. Later in the agenda, as Chair Herbold mentioned, this committee will discuss the ban on crowd control weapons. And I remember that when this was discussed over the summer, only, to my recollection, only the CPC among the so-called accountability partners talked about the harm done to ordinary people in the Black Lives Matter movement by the Seattle Police Department. And specifically in the agenda later on today, we will see the recommendations about the so-called crowd control weapons proposed by the CPC, which in my view are really good and strong recommendations, and they stand in stark contrast to the recommendations from the other accountability partners, the Office of Inspector General and the Office of Professional Accountability. And I think the CPC often stands out in comparison with OPA and OIG in supporting the rights of peaceful protest movements to not have to face constant police brutality. I'll just say, and I've said this before, I've joined many others in the movement in believing that we need a fully fledged elected community oversight board with full powers of the police, including hiring and firing. And I just want to clarify that we are calling for that because we feel that is actually what will make a huge difference, and we will keep fighting for it, but it's not in any way intended as a commentary on the work of the members of the CPC. And the overall work of the CPC has been very much appreciated, and I would encourage them to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Swant. I wanted to also mention my thanks to the CPC for inclusion of Newell Aldrich from my office in their efforts to recruit additional members to serve on the CPC, and inclusion of Newell in the interviews so that we can, over the next couple months, ensure that the CPC has full membership. I know that's a high priority for all of us. There's the standard and the bar that members of this particular commission have to meet, I think in many ways are higher than many of many examples of volunteerism and civic duty. And so it's extra important that we find candidates who are willing and able to devote the necessary time that the CPC does to fulfill its mission. I thank CPC members again who are fulfilling this mission and spending that time. And again, thank you to the CPC for your work, not just on the policy side, but also in recruiting future leaders in this effort. So with that, I move items 1 through 6 for a vote. Appointments 1753, 1754, 1755, 1756, 1758, and 1759.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor vote aye.
I'm sorry, we have to do a roll call.
I got a roll call. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Lewis.
Aye.
Councilmember Morales.
Aye.
Councilmember Sawant.
Yes.
Councilmember Herbold.
Yes.
Thank you. All in favor.
All those in favor, we have 4 in favor, none opposed, and none abstaining. Next item is appointment 01757, which disappointment of Curry Mayer, Director of the Office of Emergency Management. And we could.
I'll read that in here.
Okay, great. It looks like we have Deputy Mayor Fong with us. We have Curry Mayer here. Great. We just do some quick introductions, and we'll get into this item of business.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. Mike Fong, Deputy Mayor.
And Curry?
Yes, hi, Curry Mayer.
Hello, thank you so much. No problem. So I really appreciate you both joining us at today's meeting. We'll have Deputy Mayor introduce and sing the praises of Director Mayer. And we, just as far as our process, we're not voting in today's meeting, but hoping to do so at our next meeting on January 26th. As far as our process goes, the council will be collecting some questions to send for Director Mayer's response later on this week. And just want to have this opportunity to hear from Deputy Mayor Fong about why they are recommending that we confirm Director Mayer, and love to have this opportunity to hear from Director Mayer as well, to hear why she is interested in fulfilling this role.
I'll read this appointment into the record real quick. This is agenda item number 7, appointment 01757, appointment of Curry Mayer, Director of Office of Emergency Management.
Great. Thank you, Chair Herbold, members of the committee. It's my pleasure on behalf of the mayor to present to you the executive's nominee for the next director for the Office of Emergency Management, Curry Mayer. Director Mayer has over 20 years of experience in emergency management, both in the state of California, Washington, D.C., as well as here in our own state of Washington. And she has an extensive amount of experience around planning an emergency operations center response efforts. And her most recent role was as the emergency management manager for the city of Bellevue. And just as a side note, the city of Seattle has had an incredible track record with regard to recruiting emergency managers from our friends from across the lake, as Director Barb Graff and most recently Interim Director Laurel Nelson were both from our friends in the city of Bellevue. So we're really excited to have Curry join our team. She really understands all functions and responsibilities related to emergency management. And following a rather extensive national search during a very challenging year in 2020, we are very fortunate to have actually found what we believe is the most qualified and experienced emergency manager in our own backyard to become the next director of OEM. So I know Curry is the star of the day, if you will. So I'm going to end my comments here and give Director Mayer the opportunity to really introduce herself to you. And we look forward to facilitating the council's process with regard to questions from you, the team at the council, as well as any members of the public, as we hopefully get Director Mayer confirmed in short order. So with that, Chair Herbold, I'll turn it over to you and Curry from here, unless you have any questions for me.
Thank you so much, Deputy Mayor Fong. Really appreciate you joining us this morning. And yeah, if we just want to hear informally from Director Mayer and just hear a little bit about why you want this job, what you hope to accomplish, and how your experience in Bellevue prepared you for this job, and anything else you think we need to know.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you, council members, first of all, for spending time with me today. I'd also like to thank Mayor Durkin for the opportunity to serve Seattle. I'm really honored to be here, one of the great cities of the world. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Fong. Also, I would like to thank Deputy Director Laurel Nelson and the talented OEM team that has already provided me with a great deal of support. So as Deputy Mayor Fong mentioned, I have been in this field for quite some time. I'm very passionate not only about emergency management, but really having a positive impact on the community and for helping people. And there's many components necessary for emergency management to be successful. And I really believe that Seattle has those. So a commitment to racial and social justice, values of inclusion, learning, accountability, and stewardship, a talented and committed OEM staff, and also the belief that government works best when it works collaboratively, with the community that it serves. So this means also not only that you're a good listener, but that you have both diversity of thought that's valued and encouraged, and diversity of voices. Seattle is one of the great cities of the world, and it's known for being innovative. And so it's really exciting to have the opportunity to serve in that way. I also believe that my skills and experience working with many different organizations outside of government and public safety has allowed me to really learn how to listen to what a group values and needs, and then connect that to emergency management principles, which is really about building community resilience. So I really believe that emergency management is connected to everything, and it's our job in the emergency management profession to explain to people what that means and how not only can we help them during times of disaster or some other kind of impact to their daily lives, but what does that mean and how can they be involved in that? So that also means meeting people where they are. So understanding how social justice issues, poverty, limited English skills, or anything else that causes people to have access and functional needs, what is it they require in order to even be aware of what the hazards may be in their community? And then from that awareness, how do they get resources? How do they build resilience? And why should they trust those of us in government to be able to help them? I believe that community preparedness is really the way to go rather than individual preparedness. I also am a fan of using what we call culture brokers to kind of bridge the communication for those who don't trust government, and looking to community leaders to have strong partnerships with us. Strong regional partnerships are also important. So I spend a lot of time in Bellevue being part of a number of regional committees. I work with the Washington 211 board, which is a very robust case management system that ties people to resources and does full circle engagement with people who call and need resources. I also am on a board with the Washington Center of Excellence for Homeland Security Emergency Management, which works through all of the community and technical colleges in the state of Washington, not only to get people interested in the emergency management profession, but to really help and support a strong employment for all of Washingtonians, not just in emergency management, but in other professions as well. So through that board and through that community college network, we work with the public sector, the private sector, and students to really help them be engaged and be employed in a number of different ways. I've worked a lot with King County on the Emergency Management Advisory Council, which is an emergency management body that advises the King County Council on emergency management issues that face our county. Also chair of the Critical Infrastructure Work Group, which is a public-private partnership relationship that works on all those things that might impact critical infrastructure across county lines. So not just in the county, but with our neighbors as well. Also in Bellevue, I worked really closely with the transportation department, doing training and exercises for a debris management plan, and also engagement with other city departments on how we would make that a reality. That was the first time that had ever been done. I led the city's effort on COVID response that, just like in Seattle, was a citywide engagement. We spent a lot of time on our continuity of operations annexes and making those a reality. This was really our test of how did we do when we put those together, and how do we continue to work together across departments. So I believe that experience, my experience in California, and the work that I've done with the academic world has really prepared me to be a strong leader in Seattle, not just in emergency management, but as a coordinator and kind of the glue between departments for how do we continue to build community resilience. So again, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I thank you for the nomination and for the engagement with you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Director Mayer. Just want to take a moment to comment that it takes a special type of person in the middle of a public emergency to move to one medium-sized city to a larger city while we're still in the middle of a public emergency, and really appreciate your willingness to serve us here in Seattle, taking over from the amazing work that Interim Director Laurel Nelson has been doing over the last several months. There will be an opportunity for more of a I say with humor, grilling at our next meeting. But I just want to give my colleagues an opportunity to weigh in and or welcome you if anybody has something they'd like to contribute at this point. Otherwise, we'll see you on the 26th.
Okay, thank you so much.
Well, absolutely, thank you.
Herbold, if I could just one comment. I did want to take the opportunity to also join you in thanking Laurel Nelson, our interim director. Barb Graff initiated a well-deserved retirement, unfortunately timed right when the pandemic really hit our region aggressively. But Laurel has done an incredible job holding the fort down, so to speak, for the better part of 2020. And I just want to make sure that on the record, the executive takes the opportunity to.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Much agreed. All right. Thank you again. And we'll see you on the 26th.
All right. Thank you again, all of you, for your time. I so appreciate it. And I'm really, truly honored to be here. Thank you.
Be well. Thank you. I see that Council President Gonzalez has joined us. Thank you for being with us here today, Council President Gonzalez. Will the clerk please read into the agenda item number 8?
Agenda item number 8, decision agenda on less lethal weapons recommendations of the Community Police Commission, Office of Inspector General, and the Office of Police Accountability.
Thank you, Alex. So this is the third in a series of meetings that this committee has held since Council adopted Ordinance 126102 in June after local protests in response to the murder of George Floyd and heavy use of crowd control weapons by the Seattle Police Department. Ordinance 126102 prohibits the use of numerous less lethal weapons. And I just want to stay at the outstart that I agree that our goal is to have the strongest possible ordinance. And so that I believe is the framework that we on this committee are operating under. We share the goal to regulate the use of less lethal weapons, particularly less lethal weapons that are being used in crowd control situations. But there's some important context to understand as it relates to achieving that goal. After the city submitted the ordinance to the court as provided by the ordinance itself and required by the consent decree, again, we had to submit the ordinance to the court for the court's review as well as the monitor's review. In July, U.S. District Court Judge Robart issued a temporary restraining order on the ordinance, and the order prohibited the ordinance itself from going into effect. In August, the three accountability bodies completed recommendations relating to the ban in the ordinance. Again, both the council and the court requested the recommendations of the three accountability bodies. The council requested it within the ordinance itself, and the court requested it as part of the consent decree review that we are required in the city of Seattle to go through for all ordinances of these types. On September 11th, at the Public Safety and Human Services Committee meeting, the Community Police Commission, the Inspector General, and the Office of Police Accountability each presented their recommendations, the same recommendations we received back in August. On December 17th, we had a second roundtable discussion with the accountability bodies and the Seattle Police Department about the content of the recommendations. And today we are considering new draft legislation that reflects first the consensus items from the accountability bodies and a decision agenda for all other items where there is no consensus from the accountability bodies. So again, there's a bill that we are using as our sort of our base bill that reflects the items where everybody agrees. That's the CPC, the OPA, and the OIG. And then we're going to have a discussion and give indication about our preference on the items for regulation there is not full agreement on. The committee may vote on legislation at our next meeting on the 26th. And then after the committee vote, but before full council action, the legislation will then have to be sent to the monitor, the Department of Justice, and Judge Robart in line with the requirements under the consent decree process. This has to happen before any consideration at full council. If we want to be ultimately voting on a bill that withstands the scrutiny of the court. Again, there's no city law currently in effect prohibiting use of less lethal or crowd control weapons, and there will not be one without the successful completion of the consent decree review process related to this legislation. There are current partial limitations as a result of the Black Lives Matter ACLU lawsuit. But again, those partial limitations are the result of a lawsuit and a court order. They are not meeting our goal as a council to have policy that is reflected in our Seattle Municipal Code. So under the consent decree, Judge Robart has the final say. So it's really worth us all looking at the clues he's provided as far as it relates to his earlier review of the ordinance 126102. So the judge in the June temporary restraining order said that he was critical of the ordinance adopted by the council because he was concerned that it did not increase public safety as it was written. He also, as mentioned before, expressed interest in hearing from the three accountability bodies, as the council did as well in its ordinance. And that's, again, the key reason that the committee has met twice since that time to hear, discuss, and ask questions about the accountability body's recommendations and why the discussion today is structured wholly around their recommendations. Again, the judge is the person who must authorize any bill. Unlike a mayoral veto, the council cannot override the judge's rulings. So the council's normal powers to enact legislation under the city charter do not apply as they normally do because of the consent decree. If the court does not authorize the ordinance that the council passes to go into effect, then we will be in the same position that we are in now without any law in effect. I just want folks council members to know that we do have representatives of the CPC, the OIG, and the OPA present in case council members have questions. We have each Andrew Meyerberg, the OPA director, Amy Tsai, the Deputy Inspector General from the OIG, and Jesse Frowns from the Community Police Commission. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn it over to central staff to start the presentation. And in the presentation, again, we're going to go through, again, a quick overview of the positions of the oversight agencies. And then we're going to briefly talk about the base bill. And then we're going to walk through some policy items to further amend the base bill. And my hope is that council members with us today can express their policy preferences for options that will be contained. And the options are drafted around different less lethal weapons. And so there are slightly different options for each of the types of less lethal weapons. And my hope is that, again, that council members express their policy preference and that central staff can use that information to develop another base bill that we will then again come back on the 26th to discuss and hopefully move out of committee as our committee recommendation that again will go to the judge. So unless there are questions about that, either the background context or the process moving forward, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa Kay. Seeing no questions, Lisa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would note, so Lisa Kay with Council Central Staff and Greg Doss, my partner in crime here, has agreed to help run the slideshow for me. So I'll wait until he can pull those up and share his screen, and then I'll kick it off. So we can probably go ahead and move to slide 2, Greg, at your convenience. Okay, so committee members saw this chart at your December 17th meeting. It shows how each accountability agency would change the ban that was enacted in Ordinance 126-102 for 3 categories of use: patrol officers, SWAT officers, and for crowd dispersal. So what we're calling the base bill for today's discussion it reflects the 4 areas of consensus based on the reports submitted by these 3 agencies. Those areas would allow for specific non-crowd control uses for pepper spray, 40mm launchers, and noise flash diversionary devices, and would ban the use of tear gas by patrol officers. So that's the starting point. Let's go to slide 3, please, Greg. For this draft base bill, which as Chair Herbold said, is really just the starting point for this discussion, building on those 4 areas of consensus. So if the base bill was adopted as drafted, it would differ from the original bill banning the crowd control weapons in 4 ways. It would use the term less lethal weapons instead of crowd control weapons. But as with the original ban, the legislation would still apply only to those devices designed to be used on multiple individuals for crowd control. This is important because not all less lethal weapons would fit this definition. For example, a taser is not designed to be used on multiple individuals, and so it would not be legislated, or it would not be regulated by this legislation. The second area, the base bill would include updated recitals to reflect current circumstances, including the court's rulings, and would include the 4 areas of consensus in the accountability partners reports. The new bill would maintain a ban on the use of 40mm launchers and noise flash diversionary devices for crowd dispersal purposes, but it would allow patrol and SWAT officers to use them for non-crowd control purposes. Finally, the new bill, this base bill, would maintain a ban on the use of pepper spray for crowd dispersal purposes, but would also allow patrol and SWAT officers to use it for non-crowd control purposes. The original bill had an exception that allowed patrol officers to use pepper spray as long as it did not land on more than one individual. So the revised bill is just a little bit broader than that, allowing patrol, or less specific than that, but still allows patrol officers to use pepper spray. So I would note, with sort of some emphasis, that law is still reviewing this base bill, so this should definitely be considered a preliminary draft. So let's go ahead and go on to slide 4. As Chair Herbold mentioned, that for today's discussion, the chair would like the committee's feedback on the policy options associated with each of the five less lethal weapons addressed in the draft bill. And so for each of these, you'll see at least 3 primary options, and in some cases a 4th option. These would be to affirm the ban on the use of the device, exempt the device from the ban, or exempt the device from the ban with specific policy conditions, and then which would be either written into the legislation or drafted by the police department with the court's approval. Again, for any exemptions with conditions, so if you chose this 3rd option, the committee doesn't need to finalize any desired conditions today, but the chair is hoping that the committee could determine whether the policy conditions should be included in the ordinance or left for Seattle Police Department to develop in conjunction with the accountability agencies and the court.
Thank you, Lisa, for making that particular point. I just want to underscore it. We're, I don't think, going to have the time to get into the universe of conditions that we might want to apply to particular less lethal weapons that may receive an exemption under certain conditions. So we're not going to be able to talk about all the different kinds of conditions that we might want to apply. I welcome conversation about it, but I just don't want council members to feel pressured to identify what all of those might be in this meeting. We're going to have that discussion more in depth at our next meeting. But as Lisa stated, it would be great to hear from folks whether or not they think conditions should be included in the ordinance, or whether or not we should direct the police department to develop policies for those conditions. And of course, those policies of the police department will also have to go through the consent decree process.
Right. Madam Chair, should I go ahead and move on to the specific policy options then at this point?
If there are no, Councilmember Sawant.
Thank you, Councilmember Herbold. I just wanted to make a few general points before we go into the specifics, which I of course welcome that discussion. But I just wanted to say, as the people watching this will recall, the ban on crowd control weapons was won by the movement last June during the height of the street protests, and was put forward by my office alongside the movement. So I wanted to make some remarks related to that, and also what I think about the overall framework here. This was a crucial victory for the Black Lives Matter movement, and as many have said before me, the events of last Wednesday, and which I know most of the council members have already spoken to this, and we are in agreement about this, that it was really ominous what we are seeing from the far right. But what's ominous also alongside that is that the far right mob was greeted with kid gloves, whereas consistently, almost overwhelmingly, unanimously, what we have seen is the weapons are deployed against left-wing protests. And that's why it's really crucial to not have any weakening of the ban. I appreciate Councilmember Herbold pointing out that obviously we are, because the city is under the consent decree, we need to go through that process. So I just want to clarify that obviously we're not trying to pretend that we exist in a universe that does not have that process. But I also, as I said yesterday, feel quite concerned that in reality, the city's apparatus, the city attorney's office, Mayor Durkin, the police chief, former police chief Best, at that time, right after we had passed right after the city council had passed this unanimously, they actually shamefully used the routine procedural step of notifying the federal court overseeing the consent decree. I mean, that's a routine step, but what they really were trying to do was to use it as an opportunity to derail the ban and stop it from being implemented. And that was actually acknowledged by Judge Robart at that time, who refused to grant what they were asking, between the lines, which is a temporary restraining order on this ordinance. But then, of course, he later on, as you mentioned, he did grant that, but that was in response to a request from Trump's Department of Justice, and that request was joined by the city attorney. That's what concerns me. I cannot think of another time when the city has gone to court to block the implementation of a legislation that was passed, much less unanimously, by the city's highest legislative body. And so while Donald Trump's Department of Justice and Jenny Durkin's police department are superficially the two sides of these court case, they are actually in total agreement on this point and on the repression of protests. And there was nobody in the court representing the protesters and ordinary people who don't want these weapons deployed. So by contrast, when a different federal judge placed a different injunction on the police department, temporarily banning their use of tear gas on the BLM movement, and this was mentioned before, the police violated that injunction, and the city unsuccessfully went to court to fight to have that injunction lifted. And so I think it is important that we pass a legislation that does not have any loopholes, and I will happily support any legislation or any amendment to support ending that injunction so that the bill can go into effect. What I don't want to see is loopholes, and we're going to have that discussion, obviously, so we'll see where all council members stand, but it's very important that we don't create giant loopholes. I will acknowledge that the memo that Councilmember Herbold circulated, and also last night your office circulated the baseline legislation, which I appreciate, does not create giant loophole, and I appreciate that baseline legislation. But there are also options in the memo that Lisa will go through now that will create that opportunity. So I would really urge council members that, given the clear track record of police departments targeting progressive and left-wing movements with violence and using kid gloves in response to far-right mobs, that we hold the line and really support that principle and pass the strongest possible legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Swant. Before we move on to go through the options, Councilmember Swant, you remind me of another important piece of context that I want to remind everybody and make sure that the public understands as well. Under the consent decree, the Seattle Police Department is required to regularly review its internal policies and procedures. And they are currently reviewing their policies and procedures related to both crowd control management as well as use of less lethal weapons options. And as part of their review of those policies, their recommendations for changes to those policies will also go through the consent decree process, just like our legislation has to go through the consent decree process. So subject to the review of the monitor and Judge Robart. And I think one of my goals is not only to recommend for the consent decree review process strong legislation, but to make sure that we have a bill that the consent decree process can review alongside the recommendations that SPD is making for review of its policies. I'm very concerned that we could get into a situation where the court and the monitor are only reviewing the police department's recommendations for changes to its policies. And so again, that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we work with the city attorney on ensuring that the time frame for the police department review and submission of their policies happens in a way that allows the council to act so that the judge understands both what the council's policy preferences are, as well as the police department's policy preference. I don't want a situation where we have the consent decree review process for the police department recommended changes in policies to be happening in a vacuum without the recommendations of the council changes to the legislation. There are no questions from my colleagues. Let's move on to the policy options for each of the less lethal weapons.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So we're starting with blast balls, and I'll just give a brief reminder prior to each of these about what the devices do. You are all intimately familiar with this, I'm sure. Blast balls are round rubber devices designed to create diversionary light and sound. SPD reported to OIG that it only uses blast balls that produce light and sound and emit either inert powder or a small amount of pepper spray. The draft ordinance, that is the base bill, doesn't make any changes to this ban, or to the ban that was in the ordinance 126102, as there was not consensus among the accountability agencies on whether to allow the use of blast balls for crowd dispersal, SWAT, or patrol. Given that, then the committee's options are to retain the total ban. Option 1, retain the total ban per ordinance 126102. Option 2, which would specify exceptions to the ban for either or all patrol, SWAT, or crowd control situations. And option 3 would specify exceptions to the ban with subject to added conditions, which would then be specified either in legislation or drafted by the Seattle Police Department with court approval. I will turn that back to you then, Madam Chair, for discussion on blast balls.
Thank you, Lisa. Just looking to see whether or not folks have any comments on this particular weapon, this particular less lethal force weapon. Just a few background comments as it relates to the history of the use of blast balls. Want to remind folks that in 2016, the Community Police Commission called for the Seattle Police Department to stop using blast balls after several injuries were reported to protesters and reporters. The CPC continues to recommend a complete ban. The OPA and the OIG are not recommending a complete ban. Back in 2016, the CPC said until such time as blast balls' propensity for causing injury, including specific evidence from the past 2 years in Seattle, and their appropriate use given that risk have been publicly weighed, we ask that the Seattle Police Department suspend their use. This is what they said in 2016. In June of last year, a protester was nearly killed after use of a blast ball. And despite training, indiscriminate use, inconsistent with training, continues. The CPC recommends that the council that the ban allows for the use of appropriate less lethal options, that the ban should allow for the use of appropriate less lethal options with strong policies and accountability mechanisms outside of crowd control. But the CPC still believes that we should provide for the full elimination of indiscriminate crowd control weapons such as tear gas and blast balls, regardless of their use. There's also an old report from, I'm not quite sure what year, I think it was around 2017, called the I. James report. Council President Gonzalez might remember better than I, but one of their action steps relates specifically to the use of blast balls, and they say, absent clearly articulated circumstances, there should not be a dramatic difference between the number and frequency of blast balls deployed by unit and officer, and historically there have been dramatic deviations from the norm. What commonly occurs in similar circumstances in the application of force as it relates to blast balls. So again, there's been a long-standing expectation that the Seattle Police Department make changes to their application and use of blast balls that, from my observation, they are not fulfilling those expectations or addressing those expectations. And I am inclined to support the policy option that is identified as option 1, retaining the total ban for ordinance 126102.
Chair Herbold?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Are you calling on me?
I'm calling on you.
Okay, thank you.
I have a hard time getting to my camera to actually see what's going on my screen. So.
Oh, good to know. Okay.
Feel free to speak up.
Okay. So I am inclined to agree with you. I think, particularly after all of the video footage that we saw over the summer, where these devices that are supposed to be rolled into a crowd are actually being thrown overhead and being used in a way that apparently seems to be targeting individual members and causing injury. I do think that there has been repeated attempts and requests for better training, for review of how these devices are being used, and also repeated disregard for that. So at this point, I'm inclined to agree with you that we should just continue the ban on these that's included in the ordinance.
Thank you. Councilmember Morales, I appreciate you speaking up here. Anybody else?
Yeah, Herbold, this is
Councilmember Swan.
Yeah, and I'll put myself in the queue now. I was using the raise the hand feature. I saw Councilmember Sawant was too, but
I think Councilmember Gonzalez was before me in the raise the hand, so I will let her go.
So President Gonzalez, yes, please, thank you.
That's okay. Doesn't make any difference to me whether I go before or after you, Councilmember Sawant, but thank you. I'm happy to go next. I am also inclined to support option 1, which is retaining the total ban on the use of blast balls per the ordinance that we previously considered, for all of the reasons that you have stated, Chair Herbold, but also for the reasons that Councilmember Morales just stated as well. I'll also just note that in addition to that, in early December, of course, the issue of the use of blast balls was considered by U.S. District Court Judge Richard Jones, who issued a 27-page order in response to a motion by Black Lives Matter Seattle King County, in which there was a request to find that the police department was in contempt of an earlier injunction that was designed to prevent police from using force against peaceful protesters. And I take to heart and very seriously that the court in that particular case, and again, this is as early as just about a month ago, that that the court mentioned in the order that of all of the less lethal weapons used, the court was most concerned with SPD's use of blast balls, which the court order described as being the, quote, most indiscriminate of the 4 crowd control weapons that he was asked to examine. So I do think that there is, unfortunately, been a pretty consistent track record of misuse of blast balls in spite of a significant amount of training in this space, and in spite of the independent consultant that was hired to evaluate SPD's use of blast balls after the I believe it was in 2015 or 2016 when there was significant concerns of blast balls injuring journalists as well as protesters, again because of their indiscriminate nature once they're deployed. So I think it's important for us to take into consideration, so long as we're looking at clues and cues that we're getting from the federal courts. I think it's important for us to keep in mind the court order that was issued early in December by Judge Jones, who quite frankly didn't mince words about significant concern that the court had about how blast balls really are very indiscriminate and create a significant amount of harm to protesters. And so I think that given that order and all of the other reasons that have been stated already on the record, I would very much be in favor of option 1. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just checking to see if anybody else has a raised hand.
Can I go? Chair?
Oh, sorry, Councilmember Swan, you were in the queue.
Thank you. Of course, the ban on a total ban on blast balls was a part of the original legislation that my office had sponsored in June, which was unanimously adopted. And so, of course, needless to say, I support maintaining the total ban on blast balls. I also welcome the statements from 3 council members who have spoken in favor of maintaining the total ban. I would welcome other council members to also adopt that position. We've heard from many people in public comment, in letters, but also there are statistics that show how people are injured, sometimes grievously, by blast balls during protests. And in fact, it sort of also points towards why when we put forward the original legislation from my office, we did not use the term less lethal weapons, because I mean, yes, it's technically true that these weapons are less lethal than actual bullets that could take a life, but it's not less lethal than, for example, not having a blast ball or projectile thrown at you. So they're quite they can be quite injurious. And I thank the Community Police Commission for not only supporting the total ban now, but as Councilmember Herbal mentioned correctly, the CPC has spoken about this publicly and sent letters to the police department since 2015, 2016. I would also mention, though, that the fact that it's been like now 4 or 5 years when we not only of the position from the CPC, but also the data that has been collected over that time about how harmful these weapons are, that the police department continues to use it. I mean, I think this also points towards how, in addition to upholding a very strong ban on these weapons coming out of this committee, we also need to have an elected civilian oversight board, because there's really no enforcement, not no enforcement, but little enforcement happening of the use of these weapons by the police department. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Swan.
And Madam Chair, I have some comments as well, if this would be the appropriate time.
Absolutely. Councilmember Lewis.
Thank you. Most of my points have already been covered, particularly by Councilmember Morales and Gonzalez. But I'll just say that I would actually have a very, very hard time voting for an ultimate ordinance unless there was a complete ban on blast balls. So I agree with the consensus that's emerged here. I do just want to say that following off of Council President Gonzalez's comments regarding the contempt finding from the district court from Judge Jones, which I think is particularly instructive here, I cannot imagine more notice for the police department to be under regarding the appropriate and proper deployment per policy of these weapons. And that as late as the fall, we still had officers throwing these things overhand when it had just been eminently demonstrated throughout all summer that has always been a departure from the stated policy, and that as late as late August, there are still instances that are recorded and that are now a matter of a contempt finding against the city of officers throwing these weapons overhand in a way that that most generously could be described as indiscriminate and most ominously could be described as specific targeting of individuals. So given that, I just don't see how supplemental efforts to enforce, to train, to guide policy are going to be more efficacious than the efforts by the federal courts and the city to rein in this use over the summer that has still resulted in misuse of these weapons. And for that reason, I do support retaining the total ban on the blast balls.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis. All right, Lisa, let's move into the next slide. And I believe that is 48 millimeter launchers. And I just, I want to clarify that for purposes of this discussion, we are talking about not the launcher itself, but how it's used and what is in it, and its use to launch OC spray. There are two types of launchers. One is a single-use launcher and another is a multi-use launcher. And I would like it if we could focus our discussion today on not the equipment itself, but how it's used to deploy specifically dangerous chemical irritants in a way that is indiscriminate.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So you've got slide 6 in front of you there. So this is 40 millimeter launchers, as Chair Herbold mentioned. These can be used to fire sponge rounds and other projectiles. The sponge rounds may or may not be infused with pepper spray. And as the Councilmember mentioned, there are single and multiple use applications with different distances that can be achieved by the different types of launcher. The draft ordinance reflects the accountability agency's consensus that these launchers should be banned from use for crowd dispersal, but available for SWAT and patrol officers to use in non-crowd control situations. Your policy options are similar to, well, you'll hear these all the way through the presentation, but option 1 is to retain the total ban per Ordinance 126-102. Option 2 would reflect the consensus position in the base bill, which is to approve exemptions to the ban for patrol and SWAT. And option 3 would approve exemptions to the ban for patrol and SWAT, which is option 2, but also specify exceptions for crowd control situations. Then option 4 would be if there were those additional exceptions added, you would make those subject to conditions either in legislation or as drafted by Seattle Police Department with the court's approval.
Just to restate what I see on the slide, and I may have heard you differently, but the consensus position is to ban for patrol and SWAT, and that is what's reflected in the bill, correct? The consensus position does not include banning in crowd control situations.
Correct.
Okay, great.
Councilmember, I might also add one other thing, and that is that while for discussion purposes, there's a differentiation being made between patrol and SWAT, the bill itself, the existing ordinance 126-102 doesn't make any such differentiation. So if the council in its in the substitute or in any bill brought forward next week wanted to make that kind of differentiation, those terms would need to be defined, and we'd have to work with the accountability agencies to do that.
Thank you, Greg. Let's definitely think about putting a pin in that and returning to those definitions at a future meeting. And so again, the options are retaining the total ban as the ordinance requires, approving the base bill, which only includes the consensus position, which is the ban for patrol and SWAT, and maintaining the ban for crowd control situations. And option 3 allows approving the exemptions to the ban for patrol and SWAT, which is the same as option 2, but specifically adding additional exemptions to the ban in crowd control situations. And so I'm, again, for this item, I am inclined to maintain the ban as proposed in ordinance 126102 for this use of this particular less lethal weapon when it is used to deploy chemical irritants. Again, the CPC recommends banning for crowd control. The OPA and the OIG have not recommended banning this tool in crowd control situations. The bill as it's currently drafted represents a consensus to allow in non-crowd control situations. And again, as I've mentioned, I want to focus on regulating how the launcher is used, what goes in it, not what type of launcher it is, and specifically the use of projectiles of chemical irritants. In recognition that there is a consensus position that there be no ban for pepper spray in crowd control situations where pepper spray is non-launched and traditionally employed. So that's not only the consensus position, but that's actually the position contained in Ordinance 126102. What that means is if we look at maintaining the ban for crowd control situations of launching OC, the ordinance as drafted allows for pepper spray to be deployed in crowd control situations with some defined conditions. And I think we can have another conversation about what those defined conditions might be. But again, my inclination is to maintain the ban on deploying pepper spray by launcher, because again, I think this is a harmful chemical irritant that when deployed by launcher is fairly indiscriminate, and it makes it the deployment method makes it very hard to use pepper spray in the method in which pepper spray was designed to be used, which is again in a fairly targeted fashion to not impact large numbers of people, but to really focus on individuals who are engaged in illegal activity. So with that, I'm going to try to get back to my screen here and see whether or not council colleagues have any thoughts about that recommendation.
Councilmember Herbold, I'm happy to weigh in.
Sure, thank you, President Gonzalez.
Yeah, I appreciate your description here. I was looking at some of the court orders related to the launchers and saw that in some instances launchers were being used to the thing they were launching was something other than a chemical irritant. And so I'm inclined to again support what's in the current base bill option 2 for the reasons that you've described, but I'm open to continuing to have conversations about how this munition is used in crowd control settings. You know, there could be a world in which we want to revisit the base bill to be more restrictive of not just limiting its ban on deployment of chemical irritants, but also on projectiles that could be very, very harmful. And so I don't want to exclude the option to at least have a conversation about that. I'm not saying that's where I'm at. I'm just sort of flagging that I would be interested in learning more about this particular device and how it's deployed in in these settings. But for now, I think based on the information that I have, I'm comfortable with moving forward with option 2 as sort of the baseline of where we'll start the conversation, with the understanding that we may want to revisit this as we get more information about how this munition is deployed.
Thank you, Councilman Gonzalez. Councilmember Morales, I think you had a question.
I do, and this is actually for the Community Police Commission. I will say that I've been thinking about this whole issue much differently in the last week. And so I am curious, I'm looking at the table that we had up before, and you know, my inclination is to agree that, you know, none of these weapons should be used for crowd control dispersal, especially in the way that they have been in our city. And I'm also wondering if there is a crowd control dispersal method. I'm thinking particularly about fascist mobs that the CPC is thinking, or if there is an existing alternative method of escalation in these sorts of situations that we should be revisiting with SPD.
Definitely. So as far as police tactics around crowd control, I think that that's definitely a conversation that we're willing to have. The Seattle Police Department is no longer like the only ones weighing these bans on crowd control weapons and such. This is a conversation happening in Philadelphia, and it really presents challenges to just find better ways to not infringe on the rights of First Amendment demonstrations. But also, like, we acknowledge that there are other situations such as like terrorist attacks that we saw on the Capitol. Our recommendations deal with crowd control and specifically the types of First Amendment demonstrations that we saw over the summer. But that's definitely a continuing conversation that we're having in the CPC. And if it's helpful for reading our recommendations concerning the ban on 40mm launchers, when we were conceiving these, we definitely continue to support the elimination of chemical weapons used against protesters in any form. When we were talking about the 40mm launcher, we were more so describing the use of the foam bullets that SPD is using.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a sort of follow-up question on those themes.
And Councilmember Herbal, if you can add me to the queue.
So, Councilmember Lewis.
Right. So, you know, I think that the exchange right now between Councilmember Morales and Commissioner Franz was sort of along the lines of what I'm thinking with a lot of these decisions that we're making today. But I think the key concern or the key problem is determining the specific definitions and ways to govern the process by which something goes from a First Amendment crowd to a mob that's attacking something. And this has been the issue that throughout 2020, I think, was very challenging in our communications with the police department, is disagreement over what what constitutes a crowd of people that reflects a threat to person or property versus a crowd of people who are just showing up to be heard and demonstrate. And, you know, I think that those attendant definitions, I mean, you know, I know I'm kind of, you know, straying from exactly the policy that we're talking about here, but I think it does have implications to have a firmer grip on making sure that if there are policies that are created that envision something like a terrorist attack on a seat of government or a mob with violent intent seeking to disrupt official government proceedings with ill intent, that's not a definition that can be easily massaged to justify use of these tools on First Amendment demonstrations with with sort of implausible arguments that demonstration, you know, was an incipient insurrection. So, I think as we continue to kind of talk about these things, just as a brief digression, despite the horrible initial response by federal authorities last week to the attack on the Capitol, the reason members of Congress were not murdered or kidnapped and that those ceremonies were able to continue is there was ultimately a deployment of some lesser lethal munitions that cleared the Capitol and allowed authorities to get the Capitol under control. So it's clear that there are contexts where it's essential to have access to some of these tools. But personally, I think a lot of this comes down to tightening up the definitions of riot, of mob, of some of the things that have been used over the summer to round down peaceful assemblies and justify massive uses of force when there's just a few people that are digressing in a crowd. Mm-hmm. Anyway, sorry, that's a large kind of brain dump of some of my thoughts based on the conversation between Councilmember Morales and Commissioner Franz. But I just want to state that I'm sort of in that same place of trying to figure out where we draw some of those boundaries.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis. I just to give a little bit of a preview of my recommended policy preferences as it relates to these weapons. Right now for this particular weapon, I am recommending that we maintain the ban for crowd control situations. I'm not taking the position that the police should not have access to any less lethal weapons in crowd control conditions. And so I agree with you that we do need to have a conversation about those conditions when using in crowd control situations, and have sort of flagged that we are going to spend some time in our next committee meeting talking about the conditions, and those conditions will be applied insofar as we create exemptions to the ban for the use of these weapons in crowd control situations. And so whether or not you are in concurrence that this particular item should not be used in crowd control situations because of, this particular item as it relates to its use to deploy chemical irritants like OC, if you are in agreement that that should not be a tool that officers have in crowd control situations, then I think we can not delve further into the conversation about how to define a riot or what those conditions might be. But if you are taking a position that we want to retain the use of 40 millimeter launchers to deploy pepper spray, then I think that is the conversation about conditions under which we would allow that exemption for their use in crowd control situations is valid for this slide.
Well, no, and sorry, to be clear, Madam Chair, I concur with Madam Chair's position on this policy. I was just making a general digression that I guess foreshadows things we'll talk about later. So, so sorry, I should have included that in my remarks.
Not a problem. Thank you. Councilmember Swan.
Thank you. So I just wanted to, just to make sure my comments are about what's being discussed here, because this is a little bit changed from the original PowerPoint. Since Councilmember Herbold, you're asking, I think, for only comments about launchers launching chemical weapons like pepper spray, I will reserve my comments about other uses of launchers, like for rubber bullets, until that question comes up, unless you would want me to make those points now, which I don't think you're saying. So just on the question of, but actually before my point on that, I just want to clarify the original bill from my office, which was passed in June, banned all uses of launchers. So that was, as far as I'm concerned, that's the baseline. Right now we are talking about using launchers to deploy chemical weapons like pepper spray. Absolutely, I oppose the use of launchers for chemical weapons, and I think launchers should be totally banned when shooting chemical weapons. And perhaps the way to do that is to explicitly prohibit those pepper spray munitions. But again, that's a question that needs to be discussed. I cannot imagine a time when something like OC is launched from a 40 millimeter launcher outside a crowd control setting. So really, it's set up to sort of terrorize and brutalize a peaceful protest. And I'm sorry, I just don't buy these arguments that are being made that if the police have them, they can prevent a far right mob from causing damage. Well, they didn't. They didn't do it initially. Yes, they did it later, but they already had caused a lot of terror and damage by then. And if they had controlled the crowd from the beginning, that would not happen. But that's what shows that it's not politically neutral. What the police do is not politically neutral. They specifically target left-wing protests, labor movement actions. There's a long history about that. The civil rights protests actions were policed in a way that the KKK never faced any retaliation from the police. And so, I mean, I'm just saying that there's a long history behind all of this, so we have to be careful and make sure we understand that the police, in many ways, were part of enabling the far right terror in the Capitol. And I don't honestly believe, and I don't think a lot of ordinary people believe, that giving them more weapons will help them. At least as far as our ordinance is concerned, I think we should hold the line on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Sawant. All right, let's move on to the next item.
Okay, make sure I'm not muted. All right, so the third item here is noise flash diversionary devices. These create a bright flash and a loud report, and they're sometimes called flashbangs. The draft ordinance reflects the Accountability Agency's consensus that these devices should be banned from use for crowd dispersal, but available for SWAT and patrol officers to use in non-crowd control situations. So the policy options shown on this slide are option 1, to retain the total ban per the adopted ordinance. Option 2 would be the consensus position in the base bill that would approve exemptions to the ban to allow patrol and SWAT to use these. Option 3 would go beyond would include option 2, but then also add exceptions to the ban for crowd control situations. And then option 4 would make any exceptions subject to some added conditions, whether those would be in legislation or drafted by SPD with court approval.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think, again, just outlining some background on the use of noise flash diversionary devices. They are cylindrical metal devices, sometimes called flashbangs. They create a bright flash and a very loud sound. According to OIG, SPD reports that only SWAT teams are authorized to use. In our December central staff memo, the information we had is that there was little information around the noise flash diversionary devices were used in protests. I don't know if we've learned more about their use, and perhaps the OIG or the OPA can speak to that. But again, as background, as Lisa said, the CPC has recommended banning for crowd control. The OPA and the OIG are not concurring on that particular item. Again, my thoughts around these are very similar to my thoughts around the 44 millimeter launchers being used as projectiles for chemical irritants. even within crowd control situations, there doesn't appear to be a way to avoid indiscriminate use, and there can be significant harm because, again, this is a projectile device that as I understand it, can create some harm, and has created harm. With that, I'm going to check to see whether or not we have our friends at either OPA or OIG to speak to whether or not they've learned more from review of complaints about their use. And I'm having a hard time switching over to my camera, so feel free to just speak up.
Councilmember, this is Amy with OIG. I think we're going to defer to Director Meyerberg for the specific case usage, so I don't have anything to add on the details of their use for specific instances.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
This is Andrew Meyerberg. I can say that we don't have any indication thus far that any NFDDs were used in the cases that we've investigated.
Thank you, Director Meyerberg. So there are comments about this particular policy option, policy issue, and the options identified. Again, option 2 would be to approve the exemptions to the ban for patrol and SWAT, and maintain a ban in place for crowd control situations. That's what I'm putting on the table, but I'm happy to hear other preferences from other council members.
This is Councilmember Sawant.
Councilmember Sawant.
Thank you. My comments to some degree now will be about the pepper spray, rubber bullets, and flashbangs, or the noise diversionary devices. Sorry, I can't remember the longer term about it. Because they all have the same recommendations from the Community Police Commission and are described the same in the draft bill that was sent out from your office, Councilmember Herbold, and forwarded to other committee members last night, in addition to the memo of possible options. Unfortunately, some of those options, as we've been seeing in the presentations, could include loopholes. As Councilmember Herbold mentioned, there is a change in the baseline bill compared to the original ordinance, and I just wanted to address that. I do not object to the idea of having an exception outside protest settings. However, I do have concerns about the specific language in the baseline bill. There is one line in the baseline bill that I have concerns about, which mirrors concerns that were discussed when my original crowd control weapons ban was discussed over the summer. The change in the bill, or rather the statement in the now the new baseline bill, says, quote, deoleoceresin capsicum OC spray or pepper spray, 40mm launchers, and noise flash diversionary devices are not less lethal weapons for purposes of owning, purchasing, renting, or storing under subsection and numbers, which of course I agree with, but then there's an addition there, unless such weapons are used for crowd control purposes, end quote. My concern is that this language, the language that says unless they're used for crowd dispersal purposes, I'm sorry, it says crowd dispersal. My concern is that this language tests the quote unquote purpose of the use of whatever weapon that is, like pepper spray, for example. What happens if the police spray a crowd with mace or set off a flashbang and then say that it was not intended for crowd control or crowd dispersal purposes? It was instead intended to stop one person from throwing a bottle. And I know I'm not stating a hypothetical case. I think this has happened time after time. And again, this is, as I said, I had stated this concern at that time as well in the summer. The OPA dismissed the complaint against the officer who maced the child in the face by saying that the child was not the intended target, and that was at that time, that was the live example. It was really quite a brutal example. over the summer when we were voting on that ordinance, I had suggested different amendment language to attempt to address this issue. And I just wanted to reiterate my desire to work with the chair and the committee members on the language to focus on banning those weapons at protests, but not to make the purpose of the, or the police's stated purpose of the use as the test of whether that they are complying with the ordinance or not.
Thank you, Councilmember Swan. If I hear you correctly, you are talking about conditions that would limit the use of certain crowd control weapons, less lethal weapons, in situations that might involve a crowd, but to ensure that that they're not being used to control the crowd, but being used to control the activity of individuals within the crowd. And unless you are interested in an option other than simply approving exemptions to the ban for patrol and SWAT for noise/diversionary devices, unless you want to create an exemption to the ban to also include crowd control situations, I'd request that we hold that discussion just similarly to what I've requested of Councilmember Lewis to the next two items, which are in fact pepper spray and tear gas.
I'm happy to hold it to the discussion when you deem appropriate to discuss, but just to clarify, and maybe I didn't speak correctly to express my concern. What I'm saying is that they should not be used in a crowd at all. I mean, I don't want it to be used on sort of in an indiscriminate way on a number of peaceful protesters. I also don't want it to be used on one peaceful protester. I'm saying that if we
Understood.
Make it about the police's, their own, what they say claim was the purpose, then that's the problem.
Understood. But we're at this point, we're talking about the noise/diversionary devices, which are by their nature impact the whole crowd and cannot be used in a targeted way. So I'm suggesting that option 2, we approve only the exemptions to patrol, to the ban for patrol and SWAT, maintain the ban for crowd control situations.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
No problem. Thank you. And there are other council members who want to weigh in now. It's great. Otherwise, we can move on to the last two items. All right, last two items.
Okay, so this fourth item here is pepper spray, which distributes a substance derived from capsicum in hot peppers and causes an intense burning sensation of the skin, eyes, and mucous membranes upon contact. The draft ordinance reflects the Accountability Agency's consensus that pepper spray should be banned from use for crowd dispersal, but available for SWAT and patrol officers to use in non-crowd control situations. The options here, option 1 would retain the partial ban in Ordinance 126102. That original ordinance disallowed the use of pepper spray in a demonstration or other First Amendment protected events, but would allow its use for patrol officers as long as it did not land on more than one individual. Option 2 would approve the ban for both patrol and SWAT. Option 3 would approve, and option 3 would approve the ban for patrol and SWAT and also make exceptions to the ban for crowd control situations. Option 4 would specify exemptions to the ban subject to added conditions, either in the legislation or drafted by SPD with court approval.
Thank you, Lisa. I think in my earlier memo that I sent, I unnecessarily complicated things because the existing ordinance already includes some conditions And so I'm supportive of having continued conversation around the language that is in the existing ordinance, with the understanding that we may need to have a discussion about additional conditions that are required to be met before pepper spray can be used in a event with multiple individuals. And this is one of the items that I would like to, like Ordinance 126102 does, work to specify some of those conditions within the bill itself. And looking to see if anybody's coming off mute here. And not seeing anybody come off mute. Not seeing anybody's hand raised in the hand raising function. And so let's move on to the last item. Yes.
Okay, so the last item is tear gas, which is a chemical agent designed to cause coughing and physical distress. The draft ordinance would sustain the ban on tear gas. The recitals do note that the accountability agencies agreed, sort of their lowest common denominator was that patrol officers should not be able to use tear gas, which is option 2, but the agencies differ as to whether it should be accessible to the SWAT unit and for use in crowd control. So the options here are: option 1 is retaining the total ban per the adopted ordinance. Option 2 would be approving the ban for patrol. That's the consensus position in the base bill. Option 3 would approve the ban for patrol and specify additional exceptions to the ban for SWAT and/or crowd control situations. And option 4 would then add, make any of those exceptions or some of those exceptions subject to additional conditions, either written into the legislation or drafted by SPD with court approval.
Thank you, Lisa. Much appreciated. And again, as far as the background, as stated, the CPC is continuing to advocate for a total ban. The OIG and the OPA are not taking that position. We all witnessed, and some of us experienced, the use of tear gas night after night, specifically on Capitol Hill in a residential neighborhood. I think we are unified in our belief that how tear gas has been used has not been acceptable. And it is not acceptable that tear gas has been used in contravention of the restraining order, the temporary restraining order from Jones. We all, I think, remember the heart-wrenching story of a couple that fled their home when their baby started coughing, and fear that that couple had for their young child's life. Within this context, though, we do have to consider the concerns that we have heard, both from Judge Robard about a total ban of crowd control weapons. The OIG listed their concern about their use, specifically as related to the small particles of CS that, unlike OC, disperse indiscriminately widely, and as demonstrated by complaints from residents about CS seeping into their homes during demonstrations on Capitol Hill. Crowd control, the OIG says that the department and the council may want to consider limiting use of this weapon to full-scale riot situations involving violence. Clearly, as we've discussed before, this state definition of riot is completely unsatisfactory based on the minimum number of people necessary to declare a riot, which is 3 people. The recognition that tear gas does have a potential utility in crowd control situations is present in my mind, but I really feel strongly that any exception has to be very narrowly tailored. We can't have a repeat of the experience of the last 6 months. The SPD and council, I think, should have a conversation as recommended by the OIG about considering an outright ban, even in crowd control situations, when the use of tear gas is solely in defense of property. That is a condition I would like to consider for purposes of this legislation. I'm interested to know, and perhaps we could do a little bit of research, because again, I think the conversation, if there is a recognition by my colleagues on the council that tear gas, we might consider reauthorizing tear gas in crowd control situations dependent on conditions. I think it would be useful to know whether or not there are other cities that explicitly say that tear gas should not be used in defense of property. It should only be used in defense of life. Want to just reference also again my interest in trying to codify some of these conditions in our ordinance itself, and ensuring that again, isolated unlawful activity by individuals or small groups within a crowd should never automatically form the basis for declaring an assembly unlawful or justify the use of less lethal tools, weapons that harm multiple people. We've also talked about conditions such as the requirement to develop detailed tactical plans prior to deployment, in addition to the previously stated criteria. That is another criteria that I'm very interested in codifying. And then the other piece that I am interested in considering is delaying the authorization date for the use of tear gas in a situation as defined by conditions should not be, once this ordinance is approved by the court. I think we need to take a careful look at the gaps in training and only authorize the redeployment after such training is completed. I believe that Judge Robard spoke to this particular element of the need for training and the need for authorization of these weapons in a way that occurs only once sufficient training has occurred. So that's another element I'm interested in considering as it relates to creating exceptions to the ban with conditions. And with that, I'll pause and look to see what comments my colleagues might have. And I'm both looking for people to come off of mute or to see whether or not any council members had their hand raised. In the meantime, I see Amy Tsai has her hand raised.
Councilmember, just very briefly, in your speaking of conditions, in addition to the possibility of banning it in situations applying to property, OIG would also be supportive of not having it used in dense residential areas. So that would be another potential condition for consideration.
Thank you, Amy. Councilmember Swan. See, your hand is raised.
Thank you. First, I would say that I think that tear gas needs to continue to be totally banned in all situations, and I believe the Community Police Commission agrees. And it would be frankly shocking if the City Council considered reauthorizing tear gas in any circumstances, given that even the federal courts have created an injunction. I am also extremely concerned about the direction of the discussion, and I think this is influenced by the position that the OPA has developed of creating an exception for using tear gas when there is danger to people, or stated, this is the word of the police that there is danger to people. I don't think that passes muster based on overwhelming evidence. The police always say they feel threatened. I mean, I was at the Capitol Hill protest, and there obviously hundreds of young people, especially courageous protesters, got tear gas night after night. But my staff member Adam Zimkowski and I were also there, and one of those nights we also were targeted. And for hours before then, the police, the public announcement system, it was a disembodied voice. I couldn't see the commander's face. I don't know where he was, but he kept saying that we are some. I'm paraphrasing, obviously I don't remember the exact words, but something along the lines of we feel that this is threatening. If you keep moving forward, that's threatening. That will leave us with no choice but to deploy weapons that we don't really want to use. And the stark contrast between the protesters with whom I was standing, who had nothing with them except for their umbrellas and their cell phones, and a fully armed to the teeth police force with riot gear and with all kinds of shields. They had actual shields, but they had also body shields on every part of their body. They had helmets, and they had their weapons. There was a sniper on one of the roofs. So they and in that situation, they claimed that they were feeling threatened, and I feel like that's just a slippery slope if we create that opening. And they will always say they used this or that weapon to kill that person because they felt threatened. So I think that I would just register my extreme concern about that. But with your permission, Councilor Marable, I just also wanted to raise what's confusing to me. I'm not totally clear about how you are wanting to structure the questions and also the presentation. I mean, I'm concerned about how the options, as far as I understand, right now the options are divided into asking about approving for patrol or SWAT versus crowd control. And that confuses me because patrol and SWAT are exactly the officers that are deployed against protests. So that is one of the reasons why in the original ordinance from my office and the grassroots movement, we post things not in terms of patrol or SWAT or crowd control, but in terms of protests and other First Amendment protected events, like sort of putting the thrust on the event where a particular weapon was used. That is why, that's one of the reasons why when I last spoke, I quoted the language of the proposed legislation, because as I'm sure you'll agree, the devil is in the detail. And the language from my original bill stated that the test for which we would say that the police could or could not use, the test as, quote, it is used in a demonstration, rally, or other First Amendment protected event, end quote. That's how it was stated in the original bill, which I feel, in my view, that's much more clarifying and puts a much better test that the police's actions can be held to.
I think I agree that these are the conversation around definitions is important, and that's why Greg Doss earlier mentioned the need to have a conversation about those definitions. And I think looking at options for definitions will tell us more about which is the better approach. The policy options in this decision agenda are structured around the recommendations that we received from the accountability partners. And so that's why we're kind of using these terms, crowd control, patrol, or SWAT. They are, I think, intended to talk about circumstances, not types of officers. But again, I totally agree that this is a conversation that we need to have, and we need to make sure that there's additional clarity in the ordinance about that. Councilmember Morales, I see your hand.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be brief. I just, as Chair Herbold, we had a discussion about all of these things yesterday, and I indicated then that this is the one issue that one weapon that I really think we need to ban entirely. Tear gas is indiscriminate. It's toxic. It's been banned by international law and warfare. I just don't understand why we would use something like this in our cities if it's something that's been banned across the globe. And so especially when we see how it's been used in our city and the impact that it has on our neighbors, if we're saying if the recommendation is not to allow it or to put parameters outside of dense populations, then to me that means it is not used in our city. So I would advocate for an entire ban on this particular weapon.
And I just want to underscore that if that ends up being the position of this committee, then that's pretty much as it relates to, after having gone through all these items, as it relates to crowd control situations, that's pretty much the status quo of the bill that we've already heard from the court that they feel is overbroad. So because again, the ordinance, as already reviewed by the court, did allow for some narrow uses of pepper spray. We've continued to take that position. We've continued to state that we want to maintain the ban in crowd control situations for the launchers, for flashbangs, and for blast balls. And so I think and this may be an issue that we don't have a consensus position on, but would like to hear from my other colleagues on the committee if they have thoughts.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I have a couple of thoughts. So here's my concern, because I agree with what Councilmember Morales shared regarding this particular weapon in regards to the completely indiscriminate nature of it relative to the other things we've discussed today, the public health impacts that has, particularly in their deployment in dense residential neighborhoods that we frequently saw throughout last year. And my concern is that as we get into crafting and developing certain exceptions, that's inherently going to involve certain discretionary decision points that people in the police department will get to make decisions on. And, we had one particular evening, during the week of the most indiscriminate tear gas use in the demonstrations last year in June, a week that culminated in a very broad pronouncement from the mayor and the police department about putting sideboards on the discretion to use the tear gas. And that evening culminated in the deployment of tear gas or in the deployment of some agent akin to tear gas. So my concern is balancing that with the reality that I can definitely envision circumstances where the deployment of a weapon like tear gas could be warranted in a very rare event. I think it's worth noting that the city had not really used or deployed tear gas extensively, with the exception of the demonstrations last year, for a long history. And so there's clearly ways to rein in or limit its use. But I have concern, right, in like if we are to go and try to specify exemptions, where there are discretionary decision points and what kind of sideboards there are. And again, I think that kind of comes back to the tightening of definitions, the tightening of circumstances under which certain states can be declared to be in existence of, of riot or of a mob or whatever else. And that as it currently stands, it's my observation that those definitions were considerably stretched over the course of last year to justify the use of weapons like this. So, I can totally envision circumstances where it would be warranted. I mean, the use of a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, it is possible the electoral votes last week could have been stolen and members of Congress could have been murdered, but for the deployment of some of these weapons to retake the Capitol. But in figuring out those discretion points and putting on sideboards to prevent considerable damage to the community and to people exercising their First Amendment rights is something we really need to carefully look into in specifying those exemptions to possible ban conditions. So I'm just putting that out there.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis. Let's see here. Looking to see whether there are any additional thoughts from council members. And I'm not seeing any coming off mute.
Councilmember Herbold, I would just say that I'm inclined to support the option that you have put forward for us as a starting point. I do think it's important for us to work on this policy issue in a manner that is going to truly be responsive to the concerns that we heard from the federal court. And so I understand that we still need to have additional policy conversations about this, but I think that the option that you have set forward in your base bill is a reasonable place for us to start that conversation.
Thank you, Council President Gonzalez. I think what I would like to propose, because I'm not hearing consensus as it relates to this policy option, is that we work with central staff between now and the next committee meeting, and we bring back two options: one to retain the total ban for tear gas, and another those of us who want to allow some narrow exceptions that don't have a lot of discretion, and include conditions for use in crowd control situations. We work to develop that concept between now and the next committee meeting, and we'll have a up or down vote on both options for the next committee meeting. I just want to be fair to the difference of opinion around this particular item. Wanted to see, is that acceptable to folks?
I'm sorry, Councilmember Herbold, could you just quickly summarize that again?
Well, I think we've gone through a lot of areas where there is consensus. And so my expectation for central staff is to bring us back a new base bill for the 26th that reflects those areas of consensus. But this is an area where there isn't consensus. And so I'm suggesting that for the next committee meeting, we have two options, as painful as that may be. One to maintain the total ban, and the other to identify, for those of us who are interested in creating a narrow exception to the ban without a lot of discretion, with conditions, and potentially with an effective date that is that allows for authorization only after certain things occur. We can bring that option back, and we can consider both options in the next iteration in the next committee meeting. All right. Well, not hearing any strong feelings. Again,
I was going to say that, yeah, I would support that. I think, you know, as I think about the fact that we don't have consensus here, I am reminded about the 2017 police accountability ordinance process, in which there were several areas where there was disagreement amongst the parties about which option to set forth in the accountability ordinance. And in that instance, we did in fact submit to Judge Robar, you know, a set of options that were being considered as a policy position. And I just wonder if we are unable to achieve consensus here as a committee, if that if this area lends itself to that kind of a structure moving forward, to allow the federal court monitor and the judge to consider.
Thank you. I think that's definitely a strategy worth looking into. Councilmember Sawant, did I see you raise your hand?
Yes. Sorry, I'm not fully alive to what Councilmember Gonzalez just said, but I had a couple of questions based on what you were proposing as to the process moving forward. I don't have like an overarching objection to what you just said, but I'm also a little confused. And then I had another question, which is, isn't the current bill doesn't it reflect consensus on most of the points? And I'm not sure what the new draft that you're talking about will be the same, except for it won't have language on tear gas where there isn't consensus. Is that what you're saying?
That's my suggestion. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other,
and then, but other than tear gas, that the new bill be updated to reflect our discussion today.
Okay. And then the other question I had sort of goes back to my concern about how we're defining things. And I thanks for your response. I mean, you explained why you structured things in this way, but because that was the structure followed the structure of the recommendations of the different agencies. But I am still worried that if we structure things as patrol versus SWAT versus crowd control, that may not get to what we really want to get to. So will the draft ordinance that you're going to ask central staff to draft, is it going to use that structure, or is that open to discussion or not?
As mentioned, Greg Doss flagged the need to have some definitions around patrol and SWAT, to clarify that we're not talking about who, because patrol officers and SWAT officers staff crowd control events, but we're talking about the type of events. So we'll have those definitions, we'll have the discussion around those definitions. And if we find that they're not sufficient for regulating the circumstances under which these weapons are being used, then we could talk about a different approach. Okay, well, thank you. This is a very long conversation, necessary and thoughtful, and I really appreciate everybody's participation. Again, up on the slide, next steps, potentially introduction referral of a new bill because we have a new title. Committee recommendation on January 26th in our next committee, and then request to the monitor to review a draft bill. And if there is nothing more for the good of the order, it is 12:14 p.m. and we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.